stop to give you honor and the praise that you so richly deserve. We thank you for this opportunity that we can come to look at the business of our less fortunate population. We know that they have talents, we know that they have much to give, and we are here today to ensure that they develop to their fullest potential. We know that we can do nothing without you, and so we ask you to be in our midst, and that whatever is said and done today may bring honor and glory to your holy name. These mercies we ask in your holy and precious name. Amen.
Ryan Charles. I went based on the information that was presented. I do apologize, ma'am. I'm sorry, my voice is not as good to sing, so after the count of 3, 2, 3. Thank you very much. Please be seated. Honorable Dr. Randall Brewster, Minister with responsibility for the Ministry of National Mobilization, Social Development, the Family, Gender, Persons with Disabilities, Youth, Housing and Informal Human Settlement. Ms. Denise Harrell, Deputy Director, Social Development Division within the Ministry. Ms. Maureen Weber, Project Coordinator of the Human Development Services Delivery. Ms. Judith Alpush, Consultant on the Social Protection Policy. Samantha Bullock, Policy Analyst within the Ministry of National Mobilization. Ms. Miriam Roach, Social Assistance Officer with the HDSDP project. The media participants from various stakeholder partners, a pleasant good morning. I want to at this time thank in a very special way Bay Hill News Network, who is carrying us live. We are going live within St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the region, also being rebroadcasted in Concordia Radio in Canada, and I believe we'll soon be joined by Fun City in New York City. So persons in the diaspora are getting a feel of what is happening here with this consultation this morning, that we are presenting findings so that they can understand the direction that we are going in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. This morning our session has two objectives. One, the presentation of the sector-validated draft social protection policy to our national stakeholders, and two, validation of the policy in this draft strategic plan. So it's a mouthful, it's a lot of work, but it's not my duty to say what they are. I will now invite Ms. Denise Harrell, the Deputy Director from the Social Protection Division, to address you and welcome you.
Protocol having been established, good morning to everyone. First, I want to apologize for the absence of the Director of Social Development, Mrs. Marissa Finchburg. On behalf of the Ministry of National Mobilization, the pleasure is mine to welcome all today to this national consultation under the Human Development Service Delivery Project. The Ministry of National Mobilization have been going through the process over the last couple of months. We are at this stage and we look forward to a comprehensive final document. I can assure you that the document will be a live and working document. As the Minister who is here with us this morning, he is keen, and he is here as he has a very busy schedule this morning, so he only have a couple minutes with us. Let us give a round of applause for our Minister. Thank you for being here, Minister. Our Minister is keen on the implementation, and he is showing that by being at the sessions that we have invited him to. Thank you again, Minister. Once again, on behalf of the Ministry of National Mobilization, I welcome all. We look forward to your participation as you have done in the past, and this document we are hoping to see the final document and a working document. Thank you.
All right, if you would follow your program, you'll recognize that Ms. Weber is scheduled to come next. However, she has given way to the Honorable Minister, who has another engagement following this. As you would recognize, our ministry at this point in time is engaged in about 6 to 7 projects. And they're all happening simultaneously at different components, because you would recognize the importance of the development that transpired, and especially since our last eruption, how things have to be coordinated and synchronized in order for us to respond better to the Vincentian Society. So at this time, I would invite the Honorable Minister to address us, after which we would allow him to be excused to attend another of our events that is happening this morning. So, Honorable Minister, please.
Ms. Denise Harrell, Deputy Director of Social Development in the Ministry of National Mobilization. Ms. Maureen Weber, Project Coordinator for the Human Development Service Delivery Project, also known as the HDSD Project. Ms. Judith Alpuche, Consultant on the Social Protection Policy. Ms. Samantha Bullock, Social Policy Analyst in the Ministry of National Mobilization. Ms. Miriam Roach, Social Assistance Officer on the HDSD project. In her absence, Ms. Marissa Finchburg, who's a director who had some hiccups this morning. She was in contact with me. I want to welcome the stakeholders from the different ministries in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Also, I see a lot of the staff members here from the Ministry of National Mobilization. A warm welcome to our media and those who are specially invited guests. And let me say first off, thank you for being here this morning. Today, I return with a sense of gratitude that though the process of engagement with different stakeholders of this nation has been tedious, I can safely say it can be equally rewarding to know that we came, we saw, and we conquered the development of a national draft social protection policy framework. This policy framework seeks to provide a guide on strategies to prevent, support, rehabilitate, and develop our families with socio-economic deprivations. The Ministry of National Mobilization et al., with the National Portfolio for Social Protection, Child Protection and Development, Gender Development, Youth Development, Community and Cooperative Development, as well as Housing and Informal Human Settlement, has great responsibility to protect and support our vulnerable population, and will now be able to standardize and modernize our methods of supporting families here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines through the development of the National Social Protection Policy Strategy and Action Plan. Through support from the World Bank, the HDSD project has been able to support this development as well as support the development of a proposed management information system. While as a ministry we seek to modernize our payment mechanisms, as we have started with a sample in collaboration with the Bank of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Additionally, the process for social protection reform has begun, as well with the process of drafting a social protection bill with the intent of replacing the existing Public Assistance Act. Parallel to this, key activity presented here today for the draft on the National Social Protection Policy Framework is a draft disability bill which seeks to apply recommendation both from the draft National Policy Framework and the International Convention for Persons with Disabilities, with the intent of tabling a disability bill for approval at the different levels. The process for the development of a draft National Social Protection Policy Framework is by no means an easy task, as it commenced in August of 2021 with social action research at the community level over a 3-month period. And this led us to our first national consultation on the findings in November 2021. Added to that, we also had consultation at the secondary sector level in March of this year. Through these challenging times, we have been able to provide increased quantities of financial support to families in need due to the shocks we suffered as a result of COVID-19 and the volcanic eruption. While implementing the parallel structure of the public assistance program, we also provided programs to support housing infrastructure, programs to protect our children and women at risk. Now it is time to strengthen the existing efforts, to focus on the improvement of the quality of the services to be provided that needs a focus presently. Now, the ministry has done some labor-intensive programs for the past year in 2021, which has helped us with the rebuilding and strengthening of our people here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, as well as connecting them to greater employment opportunities so that the poverty cycle will be avoided and reduced. In order to ensure that we have positive impacts on the lives of affected families, we must first understand from our population two things. One being the source of the issues, and two being the community suggesting appropriate recommendation to eliminate these issues. And from these, the ministry would be able to make appropriate theoretical yet practical and achievable strategies to combat these negative issues. So at this juncture, the ministry is proud to say that we have now technically achieved that milestone with the assistance from our consultants. Now, Judith, we have been in consultation for quite some time, and they know from time to time I push and I ask, when are we going to have this thing? Because I do not want the year 2022 to be finished and the implementation of this policy is not achieved. So the ministry is grateful for this opportunity today to continue this exercise of engagement and hopes that we can partner with our many stakeholders to improve the quality of life in St. Vincent and the Grenadines through the finalization of the draft policy framework so that it can be processed and submitted for approval at the cabinet level and ultimately beginning the discourse of realistically implementing the plans enshrined within this policy. I wish the ministry and all the stakeholders involved continued success in today's proceedings and anticipate successful completion of this national draft social protection policy framework. So thank you again to all the stakeholders involved. And in the book of Galatians, it said we should not be weary of well-doing. And the drafting of this policy framework is part of our well-doing in the ministry and in the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So on behalf of the people of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, a heartfelt thank you, and may the Almighty continue to bless us as we move forward with this National Protection Policy Framework. I thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Minister. And as indicated, we appreciate your being here to at least give your remarks and your endorsement to the process as you head off to do so for another of our ministry's programs. At this time, I invite Ms. Weber to address us this morning.
Good morning, everyone. No, that I'm going to work for the whole day. Good morning, everyone. In the house. Cool, that sounds better. All right. Let's talk about this project. It's $10.7 million. It's a loan from the World Bank and give you all kind of numbers. What I think is the most important thing is how transformative the entire project is. I see two persons in my ministry who are here today. And I know in the WhatsApp group, they're tired of me bigging up my project, because all of them doing fancy projects, they're building roads and highways and bridges. And I say, I'm building lives, we're building opportunities. So we're bigger than all the road and highway thing. Our project is actually leading our individuals on the highway to success, on the highway to inclusion, on a path of betterment for themselves. So I love my project, and I always proud of my project. Yes, I'm Jamaican, but it's been 3 years, and I currently know the first verse of your anthem and the entire chorus. So much for that. Well, today is really a culmination of a journey on this particular activity. As the minister said, we started last August. And I'm grateful for the consultant who appreciated the concept was very important of inclusion, of listening. So a lot of time has been spent in the field. It's not Judith's document, it's not Marissa's document, it's not a minister document. Those people to me are secondary. So each time I look, I will say, Miriam, who have they spoken to? Who has been included? And of course, clearly, I make clear, are you going to Beckway? When you're going to Beckway? Is Union Island coming? Those kinds of things, because it is the Grenadines, and the Grenadines, not St. Vincent mainland. I'm an inclusion person in every single way. And we have done that, we have achieved that. We've included not just people who we think live on the mainland, but we recognize the challenges of people who live in Union Island, and their challenges are included and reflected. Those people in the Grenadines, north and south, have particular challenges. Those are reflected here. Of course, not only not my own personal community, persons with disabilities have always been at the table on this conversation as well. So I commend the consultant, I commend Marissa and her team for putting up with this. So we've had like how many consultations? We stopped counting now, you know, how many we've had. And at the time we had several other consultations as well. So we are almost at the end of this part of the journey. It's like a relay race. Once Judith finishes here, I know the ministry will take a baton and run with it to the next leg. But then, of course, Marissa knows me that I'm not going to assume the baton pass and I'll attempt an eye for that one. Because as a Jamaican, we know how a relay really work. All of we run fast our own leg to get to the end and bust the tape and we win. So it's a relay, we're staying focused. Judith has run her leg of the relay. The team members here have run their leg of the relay. We're going all the way to the end for what? For inclusion and for quality of life for Vincentians. Thank you for being here. Also session today. Blessings.
And with that, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of the opening part. We will now delve right into the working sessions that we have. Just to give you an idea, I believe each person would have an idea. Up on the screen, please. If our IT person can assist. We would have Ms. Judith, who would now take us through the working session. And just to give an idea as to what those bits and pieces would be, she would look at the social protection policy development, the status update and rationale, then the presentation of the validated draft social protection policy, and we would get into plenary, have the conversation, say whether or not you agree, disagree. Then we look at defining the scheduling key activities in the strategic plan. We break for lunch, then we define and scheduling key activities again, do feedback, we look at validating the process, and the proposed institutional arrangement, and then we would wrap up in the evening. We expect it to finish, give or take, about 3:30 this afternoon once we all work assiduously together. So I will now turn over to Ms. Judith, who will take us through the rest of our day's proceedings. Welcome back home.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Philco. It's good to be back in St. Vincent. I shared with the minister and a couple of people when I landed here on Sunday. I got that same feeling as I do when I land in Belize. So the first stint here, which was 2 months with my colleague, we found people to be very warm and welcoming, people willing to, really walk this walk with us. And it's been quite a journey. And I continue to say that I am grateful, very grateful, to have been afforded the opportunity to do this consultancy. My passion, I'm a social worker by calling, I feel, and also by training. And I've been working on human rights issues and primarily in child rights and women's rights for at least quarter century now. And it naturally lends itself into social protection because women and children often are some of the most vulnerable. And so it leads you quite naturally as a social worker into the whole issue of social protection. I was lucky again to actually work as the equivalent of the PS of the Ministry of Human Development for around 13 years, working on social protection issues in Belize. And so it's so rewarding, so fulfilling to be able to have the opportunity to come into the Caribbean, come into a sister island, and really share and facilitate a process. So what I'm going to present today is very much, as Maureen said, it's not my document, it's not the ministry's document. It reflects the collective. It really reflects everybody's work over the past almost a year, because we've been doing this since August, so maybe short of that, 8 months. Let me open my presentation here so I can follow along. And then I ask your indulgence from now, because I'll be working along with Otto, who's all the way up there, to change my slides for me. So can we have the agenda so I can quickly go through the first? Yes. Okay, so as Mr. Jeffers was saying, today is really about a continuation of a process, really. Many of you have been accompanying this process since the beginning, and certainly I'm hoping that many of you were in the sessions in March that we did. So it's really continuing to build on these participatory spaces that we have had over time. And today I want to reflect back to you where we are in the process in terms of what we have crafted together, and then to delve a little deeper in so to present the entire social protection policy to you. And that's going to be a little tedious maybe, because there's a lot of slides, but I thought that it would be useful for us to go through the entire document, because people who have been accompanying the process have been seeing it in bits and pieces. So this is the first time for us to look collectively, for us to look at it in its entirety. And then after that, for us to do a bit more work in the area of the institutional strengthening area, as well as looking at activities. So getting into the strategic plan that accompanies the policy and kind of pulling it out or teasing out at activity level, so that we will have a very robust 2 pieces of a document at the end of the process. So that's basically what is the intention today. So I have we have to do some adjustments with the time, but I think if we can work assiduously, as Mr. Jeffers said, we could be out of here a little after going on 4, I would say, given the late start, no? Can you give me the process to date slide? One more, okay. So just to share with you, we started this with the inception meeting in August, talking to the ministry about what exactly is it that was being envisioned for the social protection policy. Along with that, we looked at all, and I'm saying we because I have another colleague, John Flowers, who I'm working with, who unfortunately could not be here in person. But we did a desk review of all the studies, etc., that have been done on St. Vincent and the Grenadines, looking at the laws, looking at policies, looking at reports, the full gamut of all the work, and it's considerable work that has been done in the area of social protection. We married that with key informant interviews. So we spoke to some of you perhaps in the first instance. What were your views on social protection? What were some of the things that you were doing? We went on the ground to do participatory action research, really focus group discussions. And that was so fortunate because we went from one end of the island to the other. And crossed in between at Mesopotamia, so we got to see all of St. Vincent. And because of COVID, we had to link with the Grenadines virtually, but that was still such a robust discussion with Union Island. So we went on the ground, we spoke to people in the communities, spoke to the different constituent groups, if you will. So persons with disabilities, single mothers, older persons, young people. We did all these focus groups in various communities within St. Vincent to gather people's viewpoint on this whole idea of social protection, what poverty meant to them, what was their experience of poverty and vulnerability. And it was a very rich discussion. Along with that, in order to open up to get even more views, we did an e-survey that was sent out by phone, and we just opened that up to the populace so that people could give us information about how they saw it. They answered a questionnaire on what their thoughts were about social protection. And that too was a gold mine in terms of just people's view. And one of the good things about the e-survey was that we got feedback from a lot of people who were not necessarily being vulnerable or poor. There were more people who had jobs, who were working. So through that survey, then we were able to get the views of the taxpayer, if you will, people who will be funding these government programs. What were their views on this? So that was a gold mine. So we pulled all that information together, and we brought that to a stakeholder consensus building workshop in November. And that was a mixed methodology. I'm sure some of you participated in that as well. Unfortunately, we couldn't be on the ground. We were in Belize. But what was intended as a 2-day workshop actually got extended out to 2.5 days. And I'm grateful for that, because people were so willing to come back and to share and to input, because the discussion was so rich. So out of that then, what we found from the desk review, from all the participatory pieces that I talked about, the key informant interviews, etc., the paper that we produced from all that, and people's feedback into, us reflecting to say, this is what we're seeing, what do you think, what are we missing? Then we were able to pull together a draft social protection policy and strategic plan. And after that was pulled together, the first draft, we reflected that to the Ministry of National Mobilization as the focal point for the government, and we got their initial input. I was also able to talk to other consultants working on various aspects, because it's kind of like this process should have been a bit linear in terms of the policy should have finished first, and then some of the laws come after to support or to underpin the policy. But we're running consultancies in parallel. So it was important for us to have a space for the consultants to reflect on what we were seeing from the policy. And it gave us the advantage of saying, what are you hearing? What are you hearing in your consultations with disabilities on the Disability Act? What are you hearing with your consultations on the Social Protection Act? What are you hearing from MIS? In terms of, are you seeing all the issues reflected here? So in a way, it benefited the policy that these things are working in parallel, because we were able to also check in to make sure that we are covering the ground. So that draft then, or that second draft, version 2, was taken into sectoral validation workshops that we did in March. And so we were able to virtually convene sector by sector. And there are 4 sections, or a total of 5, I should say, and we're going to talk about that a little later. But we were able to do these sector validation workshops so that people could look at it, people in those areas with the expertise could really drill down at what we had pulled together. Initially, our TOR had set a 2-day national validation workshop, but just from the experience, we thought that it would be far richer if we could take the time to do sector by sector. Because one of the things that John and I have been committed to is to make sure that we are just instruments, we are facilitators, we come with technical knowledge and experience, but this is really your document. And so we want this to be as reflective of what people in St. Vincent and the Grenadines say they want and need. what they want as the basis for the kind of society that they want to construct. Because this is really about the protection and support and building up of your human capital and really protecting your most vulnerable. So these processes are very important to us. And now here we are at the Social Protection Conference to continue this dialogue, to reflect back to you the work so far, and then for us to take it to the other level. Next slide, please. By design, this policy is very qualitative in its approach rather than quantitative. So I know when we did the sector consultations, people were saying about SMART objectives and targets, etc. But I really want to say that it is deliberately qualitative for a number of reasons. It avoids putting a sunset on the social policy and for there to be flexibility in establishing appropriate time references for monitoring and evaluation. One of the things that we found out was, data, and this is a malady throughout the Caribbean, because every time I go to Caribbean conferences and in my own country, it's a malady in terms of data, the availability of data to be able to monitor and evaluate, and the availability of that to establish baselines so that you can, you're not just shooting in the dark, but you actually are basing your targets, etc., on solid ground, on solid data. So, and because this policy is aspirational, because one of the things that people talked about was a progressive realization of universal social protection. And so it's going to take a while, for us to have that universal social protection that people talked about in so many ways, and it's reflected in this policy. And also for simplicity and ease of communication of what the strategic intent is. Next slide, please. So we felt comfortable doing this from a qualitative point of view because there are so pieces working together. So our TOR had called for a comprehensive M&E framework. And so we figure that's where the measurement will be. That's where the smartiness will come, if you will. So the M&E framework forms a very critical part of the policy itself. And it's really the response to, as I said, the smartiness. So having the necessary and sufficient technical parameters for ensuring the measurability of the results. So the measurability of the goals and objectives. And we used a very robust vertical and horizontal logic within the M&E framework to make sure that the results could be measurable, and you'll see that as we go along. So what you have there is just a graphic representation of what I talked about. So all these pieces are interconnected, right? The social policy, the social protection policy document itself links quite logically with the 5-year strategic plan, and you can't separate that from the M&E framework. So these 3 pieces work together to make sure that you can articulate what your policy intent is, how you're going to operationalize it, and how you're going to measure it, the smartness of it. Make sense? So just to provide that information, because I know that there were these issues being raised. Next 2 slides, please. So one of the first things we had to do was to really get a hold of some key concepts within the Vincentian context. And one of them is social protection itself. What is social protection? And if you look at all the literature, and there's considerable literature out there, it depends on whose literature you're looking at too. Are you looking at World Bank? Are you looking at the Brits? Are you looking at various entities? Are you looking at UN? And within the UN, are you looking at UNDP, or are you looking at ILO? So it depends on whose literature you're looking at and whose school of thought in terms of what social protection means. And what we did was to contextualize it. So with all that we were hearing, what does social protection mean within the Vincentian context? So what we did, we looked at all the technical literature, we got all the feedback from the various stakeholder consultations, and one of the things that we found, next slide, is that there are certain consensus responses. So there were certain things that kept popping up in terms of how Vincentians, no matter how we talked to them, if it was within the stakeholder groups on the ground through the e-surveys were conceptualizing social protection. And what came clear was that this issue of public assistance or social assistance, it's not charity, it's a human right. That came through very clear. That not because you're sorry for people, it's because people must live with dignity. That is their right. So that came very clear. And that the government, the state, is the main duty bearer, to use that human rights term, so that the social protection programs and interventions should be financed primarily from public funds. And this is not to be, it sounds very logical, but it should not be, it really needs to be highlighted, because as you look at the way things are configured in other countries, like in African countries, etc., this is not always the case, that the state takes up most of these programs. So that came very clearly through to us, and this is in fact happening because there's considerable investment already that the government is doing, the government of St. Vincent and Grenadines is doing in social protection programs. It's just about targeting, tweaking, making sure it gets to the right person, and maybe streamlining some of the methodology or how it's operationalized. The other thing that came through very clearly, that NGOs and other non-state actors have an important role to play in the delivery part, not necessarily the financing, but implementation and delivery of social protection interventions, and that the aims of social protection should be to protect the poor and vulnerable from falling deeper into poverty and help them to pull up by their bootstraps, if you will. So to build their skills, there was a lot of focus on building resilience. We heard that over and over again. So out of that then, what we did was to come up with this definition: a set of government-led programs and interventions designed to alleviate poverty and shocks by promoting and enhancing productive inclusion and a life of dignity for individuals and households throughout the life cycle. Now, when we did the sector consultations, we said government-led because the state has primary responsibility, but it's not the state alone, is what government-led was getting at. But when we did the sectorial consultations, people said, you know what? We really need to articulate that very clearly. And so we've added then that these interventions are designed and implemented in collaboration with private sector, civil society, international development partners, and other stakeholders. People within the sector consultations felt that we had to spell that out, and so we have. So this is a complete definition that we have now after the sector consultations. Next slide. Okay, so the other thing we had to talk about was vulnerability. What does the vulnerability mean, and who are the vulnerable people within the Vincentian context? Because we talk about the poor and vulnerable, poor and vulnerable. So the definition, vulnerability refers to an exposure or susceptibility to shocks and stress, and the inability of persons, households, or communities to successfully cope with their adverse effects. And making the point that vulnerability may be caused by economic, social, those are the two that we had. But in the sectoral consultations, of course, people said, no, you absolutely have to include environmental, and so we have. So vulnerability may be caused by economic, social, and or environmental factors. And who are those vulnerable groups? We have here single-parent-headed households with minors, so making that very clear distinction. Teen mothers and their children, persons with disabilities, older persons, persons with mental health issues, persons with chronic health problems, youth at risk, unemployed households, large families, especially those with a high dependency ratio. So we're talking about those families where only one person is employed or one person is getting benefits and everybody is living off that income flow. And these are usually, as you know better than I, multi-generational families within one setting, within one space, if you will. Survivors of gender-based violence, persons displaced by natural and man-made, that was an addition that we put in from the sectoral consultation, man-made disasters, persons living in disaster-prone areas, and persons who are housing insecure. And we are going to have definitions within the policy of a couple of things that were asked for. Housing insecure, what does that mean? So within the policy, within the text of the policy, within the glossary, you will see that housing insecure, when we talked about that, is talking about a gamut of things. So people who are homeless, or people who are in precarious housing, or people who are in informal settlements. So anybody who, is not renting properly or does not own their own piece of land, who is not living in housing that's properly constructed with proper material, that's what we're talking about, and we will have a definition for that. The other thing is youth at risk, and so there is a definition of youth at risk that has been developed within the Caribbean, and we'll be using that in the glossary. So we're talking about young people who come in conflict with the law. We're talking about needs, so youths who are neither in employment, education, or training, NEET, and other young people. So there are 4 categories there, and we'll ensure that those are in the glossary. Within the sector consultations, there were 2 groups that came up. Child and sibling-headed households, that I want to check in to see if we're going to include that. And I think we have consensus on that because that came up in several sectors. And also LGBTQ persons as vulnerable groups. So that's a discussion that I think needs to happen. I know that this group had come up within the discussions within the ministry itself as a vulnerable group, and there were some concerns around, how does that work in terms of the legal parameters that we're operating in, etc. So I think that's like an issue that we need to talk about. Because many times, these people, we talk about intersectionalities and vulnerabilities. There are often many intersectionalities. So it's impacting on you economically, socially, environmentally, and you become more and more vulnerable. So, a single parent with small children who is unemployed, or a single woman with small children who is unemployed and living in the red zone, those are multiple intersections, multiple vulnerabilities, and they intersect. And similarly with LGBTQ, because of the issues within society, both legally and culturally, there are many intersections there as well. So in terms of just their visibility, in terms of the social exclusion, and if they are women with children, if they're trans people who, don't even have any kind of legal recognition, and they're unemployed, and sometimes they're unemployed because they're trans, these intersectionalities. So how do we reconcile all that within the realities of what we're trying to do, which is to ensure dignity and protection for all, is my question that I want to put on the table. All right, next slide. Other sectoral recommendations that I think need to be put on the table are to share with you how we dealt with it. People wanted, at least one group, wanted an inclusion within vulnerable groups of persons who are affected by political victimization to be added as a vulnerable group. Our technical recommendation is that perhaps we can include them within the guiding principles of the social protection policy, the one that has to do with dignity. So I have it there, if you see dignity, the principle of dignity. All beneficiaries of social protection intervention shall be treated with respect regardless of their ethnicity, religion, ability, sex, sexual orientation. This is another suggestion as to where we can put this as well. Socioeconomic status, political affiliation, or geographic location. So that's our technical recommendation, to include the persons who are affected by political victimization to reflect it there in the guiding principles. But I will pause after this and get some initial feedback, if you don't mind. And then the other recommendation that came through was to include hosts of persons displaced by natural and man-made disasters as a vulnerable group. Because, people kept feeding back to say, well, when people take in others, family or friends, etc., it causes strain, it causes stress, and it can push families who are teetering on the edge, they can be pushed also into beyond the lines, if you will, beyond the poverty line. Otherwise, the electricity bill, they go, the food bill, they go, everything, they go. So one of the suggestions that we are making is to include a specific activity under the social assistance area to address families, hosts of persons with disabilities. So in the design and in the response of humanitarian assistance, that within your social assistance programs, that you will consider hosts of persons who have been displaced as people who would qualify for some kind of support and assistance, is what we're saying, instead of putting them in as a vulnerable group. I want to pause there for first reactions, please. To especially this issue of how do we treat with the LGBTQ persons? Should we include child-headed and sibling-headed households as a vulnerable group? And should we include host families as a vulnerable group? Yes. I think we need to send around the mic.
I thought maybe first of all, Julie, thank you again for taking us through this part of the process. First, I experienced for myself post the volcano, working with Nassim, we're collaborating, and we had persons with disabilities who would be placing in homes. They were displaced. And of course, for our community, the needs tend to be a little bit larger sometimes. The child or the young adult may be in person's minds disruptive, and therefore puts a lot of pressure. Cope is not financial. So it helps at least to remove the financial part of the challenge that the household will face. I think it should definitely be considered. Now for the elephant in the room, because nobody speaks about a community that exists, but it exists. No different from when, in the days way back when, if you had a child who was quote-unquote the R-word, retarded, you'd hide him or her. So we've been through that. We're now in the period of a person who has a child or children or a young person who is a member of the community of the LGBTQ plus community. And we don't want to talk about it. It's a real thing, it's a part of our space. We know, particularly in the Caribbean, all kinds of laws that say what you can and cannot do, and they don't really exist. But we do know they exist, and the suppression actually hurts. Now, a person who is a trans or a person who is considered to be a lesbian, or the labels are, he or she, particularly from a poor household, they're going to be discriminated against within their own household. There's access to education, and by extension, they're going to be in that vulnerable population group. Now, we're not talking about sanctioning or licensing or breaking the national country regulations. We're talking about the fact that who is vulnerable. And this is a group that is vulnerable. We're talking about dignity. It means everyone has that right to dignity. And I go back to the fact that decades ago, persons with disabilities were considered and hidden away and scorned or ignored. And by extension, if we're going to mature as a country and as a society, we need to get to that point as well. Of course, spoken as a peer, as an aunt with two nieces who are in the LGBTQ community, I get discrimination, but I also get the joy of inclusion.
Thank you. Any other opinions on this? Maybe if we take them one at a time, should we include the the child-headed households and sibling-headed households as a vulnerable group? That's the easier one, yes. Should we include hosts of displaced persons as a vulnerable group, or do we treat with them as an activity, like a specific strategic action maybe? How do we handle that? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I'm thinking like for the host, you have to consider a period of time because the families or individuals may not be permanently residing within that family. So maybe an action or an activity, but it's not going to be a permanent thing because the people might move on. Okay?
That was our thinking as well. That
Right.
was our thinking.
Okay,
So
thank you.
we definitely treat with it within the policy and plan. Sorry, yes. You treat with it within the policy and plan, but not as a indeed, as you said. Yeah, are there other opinions on that, or are we comfortable? Yes, sir.
My area that I'm agreeing this group need to be looked at, the LBQT.
Yes.
They, besides vulnerable, our culture has placed these people in a very peculiar situation. We are a developing country and we have to face the changes that have taken place worldwide. But stigma is a situation that they face. And even though we put in place policies and law, we have to get around in re-educating people to accept ways of life. Because very often, while we put in place the policy and for get them out of the closet or from being hidden away, or they living a life of they can't express themselves unless we educate to accept and stop stigmatizing. We could put all the policy that we want in place and all the laws. It could remain that some of these, especially from the poor class, they will continue to be vulnerable.
Yes, I agree. So it's in the implementation, but what we're talking about here is, can we at least, within this policy, acknowledge that this situation exists?
Well, we have to.
And then from there, we can talk about, the implementation. So, by making them, by
Accepting that they are there,
yes,
and they are part of.
within an official government document. That's the first part of saying, what we acknowledge, and at the very least that these people, this community, these persons should be treated with dignity, at the very least.
Also, to the law of the country has to also adapt to so that these people will have freedom of expression just like anyone else.
I agree, but I know that that's quite a fight coming from Belize, where we have had this discussion and we have had this reckoning. It is, I know, a very involved topic. Thank you, sir.
Thanks. I think in relation to, I agree with Blake Brown in terms of the treating it as an activity in terms of the persons from the disaster, the host families should be treated as an activity. But I'm wondering in terms of the whole aspect of the child-headed household or the sibling heading. I can understand the sibling heading if the sibling is above 21 at least. But I'm wondering in terms of the child-headed, how are we putting that into a policy itself when in fact a child under 21 should not be a head of a household? So I'm not too sure in terms of how we are, the definition we are using in terms of a child-headed household and why as a nation, we accept it as such. Not that I'm saying in terms of the LGBT that we are not accepting it in terms of that's different, but the whole aspect of a child-headed household, for a child to be under 21 and heading a household, I am not too sure what policy initiative other than saying that that child should be placed in foster care we need to do for a child under 21. So that's the only hard part I find.
Yeah. 18. But people were saying that these situations exist, and so, to acknowledge it and then decide how we're going to treat with it. It's the same thing, So putting it under the vulnerable groups to say that these situations exist. This is my understanding, that there are households headed by people under the age of 18, right? And that they need to be acknowledged as a very vulnerable group. And then within the policy, within the plan, then you decide how you're going to treat with it. Is, I think, what I heard in the sector consultations. And that makes sense. Yeah. Yes.
I am in agreement that the host family should be a time-specific activity, because after that time period, the families might transition back to their original homes, or stakeholders can step in, to sort of buffer the strain on the affected families.
Okay, excellent. All right, so it sounds like we have consensus on that one. Are there dissenting opinions or strongly held beliefs about us treating with host families as more an activity because it's time specific, etc., or reflecting it in a strategic action somewhere in the policy? Is there an objection to us including LGBTQ as a vulnerable group? Okay, and then what do we do with the child-headed and sibling-headed households? Do we include them as a vulnerable group? Pardon?
Just because we don't know how they respond. Maybe we should decouple them first of all. Sibling-headed household, I don't think it can be an issue really. I mean, I would use my example. I dead and gone, and my son might be 30, but my daughter is 21.
Right.
She's responsible for Brian because he can't be responsible for himself. So it's a sibling and a child. So what would happen then? That person wouldn't have an entire... And we need to also think about our population. It's not us. It's working class people. It's inner city people. It's persons who don't have access to the same kind of benefits and environment that some of us have. And if it exists now, I can only speak in the Jamaica context in some of the inner city communities that I work in, where it's a 20-year-old and the father gets shot and killed on the road, and he or she taking care of the children that they don't live. So what would we do? No benefit for them because it's not allowed? Question.
Okay, I am just looking at the reality that exists. The thing is, we have a lot more female-headed households. And if that mother passes, you can find that there is a sibling, 20 or even 18, who heads that household. So I am thinking that we should really consider them as a vulnerable grouping, because it is our reality. Thank you.
Okay, so we're clear on the adult sibling-headed households. Child-headed? Are we good with that?
Child-headed. Maybe what we need is the definition for child-headed household.
This is a household where it's headed by someone under 18. So this is my understanding because of the sectorial. I know in the Belizean context, you will stumble upon that as a reality in a scenario that you just painted, but the older sibling happens to be under 18. Or when we have internal migration, for instance, the mom is working somewhere, yeah? And in the household, so the mom is absent for all intents and purposes. And within the household, there's a 16-year-old, 15-year-old who is taking care of everybody, and mom pops in once a month or so. So how do you treat with that? Because
Mom manages from wherever she is.
Exactly.
The Grenadines,
Which
the
you know
US,
is
by telephone every day.
Exactly.
But the thing is, the way I am looking at it, 18-year-old to be head in a household, I think, yes, they're in the vulnerable grouping, but where child protection is concerned, they should have an input as to what is happening in that family as well.
No, absolutely. So we're not talking about how you treat with it, how you respond to it. We're talking about just the recognition of vulnerability, yeah? Okay.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Boyd here, Luan. So, what we are looking at, and I heard you mention it, so for clarity, is just that we are identifying the vulnerable groups,
yes,
not the specific activities, how we deal with them.
Yes.
Okay, fine. So, based on reality, yes, I would also agree with having those that have been mentioned as part of the vulnerable groups. So I would agree that those are vulnerable groups within country.
Excellent. All right. Any strong dissenting opinions before we move on? Okay, it sounds like the ayes have it, right? All right. So thank you for that. That helps with some of clarify some of the areas. Now I want to get into the policy and walk you through, and it's going to take a little while, as I said, but I think it's necessary because we've been seeing, those of us who have been accompanying the process, have been seeing bits and pieces. So I want you to see the whole thing in its entirety, and so that we can see then what's missing, how it's fitting together and what's missing. So, next slide, please. To start with, the vision that was pulled together, and again, this is our trying to pull together all that we heard from all the various points of contact with people. And the vision for the policy: all residents of St. Vincent and the Grenadines live a dignified life in an enabling environment that fosters equitable opportunities to achieve self-reliance, realize their full potential, and actively contribute to the continued growth of a just and economically prosperous society. When we did the sector consultations, people were comfortable with this and thought that it pulled in. So we were trying to pull together all the ideas, all the highlights that were brought to the fore, no? The other thing with the policy is that, especially when we did the sector consultations, and the big consultation workshop, one of the things that came through was that people felt that in St. Vincent and in the Grenadines, we need to move towards a universal social protection floor, right? That we should be, that is the ultimate aim. And so we looked at a progressive realization of a social protection floor, because this is considerable investment. Although you have a lot of money invested, it's really about recalibrating. It's really about bringing things together, looking at the gaps and filling the gaps. So what we've set out is a progressive realization, this concept of a progressive realization of this social protection floor. So in the short term, in the first 5 years, which is really the time frame of the strategic plan, it's about setting the table towards this social protection floor. So it's defining what a social protection floor is within the Vincentian context, because you know, in the various schools of thought, there's a high road and a low road, if you will. So there's the low road of just the basics, education, income, health, and then there's the high road, like the Jamaicans have taken, where they put in social care and protection pieces, etc. They have a really nicely articulated social protection floor, which they developed over this concept over 10 years, by the way. It took them a while. Hopefully it won't take so long here. But it was really groundbreaking in the Caribbean what they were doing. So defining what are the elements of a social protection floor within the Vincentian context and using a very participatory approach the way we have done with the policy, and then at the same time expanding, strengthening, integrating, rationalizing the existing social protection program, so in the short term, and then building on that. So once we have the gaps identified, right, the floor and this is the floor, this is where we are, these are the gaps, to close those gaps, to fill those gaps, and continue the process of strengthening. And then in the long term, because we're figuring this is going to take 15 years or more for you to really have a universal social protection for all Vincentians, so universal health care for everybody. You're talking about things like income security, so it's like unemployment benefits, things like that, that I know that, so expanding this whole concept of social insurance to include unemployment benefits, to include non-contributory pensions, things like that over the life cycle. So this is going to take a while. So we've written in this idea of the progressive realization, and that's why we took a more qualitative approach to the way we have written the policy to factor in this this progressive realization. Next slide, please. So we have the vision, right? We have this concept of the progressive realization of this universal social protection floor. There's also guiding principles that underpin the policy, and those are human rights, non-discrimination and equality, gender responsiveness, equity, dignity, timeliness and reliability, child-centeredness, transparency and accountability, participation, social solidarity, and it being inclusive. So, in the sector consultation, people considered these principles in depth, and there were some good suggestions about, changing language and so forth. So there was general consensus on these should be the principles, and then there was some very helpful input from the various sectors in terms of, tweaking and language that should be used, etc. Are we missing anything? You can't see? Sorry, go back one, please. Yes, sir. The one before, please, Otto. No, it's a slide before, sorry. It's not that one they want to make bigger, it's the slide before. That one. Yes, sir. Okay, we have the older persons identified as a vulnerable group in that listing that we had before that we were discussing. And then in terms of, in various areas, under dignity, that your age still shouldn't matter, under non-discrimination and equality, there are things that speak to. Okay. All right. So hold that thought, and as we go along and we get into the meat of the policy, let's see if it's sufficiently reflected there, because you're going to see it reflected, older persons being reflected. So then you tell me if you still think we need to delve deeper. Can we agree? All right, great. Yes, ma'am.
If we change the whole aspect to what we would refer to as vision statement, then I think in terms of, instead of saying child centered, we should probably just put people centered.
Okay.
Because we changed the whole aspect for the vision. In terms of vision is very inclusive as well. So from the guiding principle, it should be people centered.
People-centered gets reflected in many ways, but I think that the reason why they wanted child-centered here is that, to highlight the same, like gender responsiveness, that's an area too of intersectionality. So apart from generally talking about upholding people's human rights, being non-discriminatory, equality, equity, inclusive, participatory, social service, all of those are people-centered from a broad perspective. And I think what the discussion was around the gender responsiveness, looking at, you could really miss the various aspects. So what's in the best interest of men, women, girls, and boys from the gender perspective, and also looking at children, that things are child-centered, because they have an additional vulnerability, if that makes sense. But I will take it into account and see how we can ensure that it's highlighted. Yeah? Yes, ma'am.
I'm just wondering, included there is the idea of access.
Yes.
Is it?
Yes. Let me pull up. Let me pull up. In the interest of time, yes, I will write it down to access, and then I'll come back to you on that. I'm noting that access, but I know that issue came up. I can't quote a chapter and verse right now. It's taking a while to open. Because the access issue comes through in dignity too, in terms of like, you should be treated with dignity no matter, and you should have access to social protection services, no matter where you live, no matter your race, color, creed, sexual orientation, political affiliation, that you should be treated with dignity and have access to.
It should not fall under like a separate guiding principle.
So you would want to see it as a separate guiding principle. All right. Got you. Any other burning issues before we move on? All right. Next slide, please. So the way we organized the policy, we used a taxonomy, a social protection taxonomy. And this is something that's also used by the OECS as well, as the way they organize their social protection framework. And so we're going to be able to really be in tandem with what's going on in the OECS as well. And so we broke out then, if you look at the 1, 2, 3, the third line there, we broke out into really the key strategic focus areas of social assistance, social care, social insurance, labor market policies and interventions, and we added another one, which is cross-cutting, which is institutional strengthening. right? So if we go to the other slide, you see how the policy, the logic of how the policy is organized. Next slide, please. There, so you have the vision, you have the guiding principles, and then you have the goals in the various focus areas. So SA for social assistance, SI for social insurance, SC for social care, LMP and I for labor market policies, and IS for institutional strengthening, right? So then you have the goals under those focus areas, the objectives, and the strategic action. So this is the way that we have organized the entire policy. Yes, ma'am. Pardon? Child participation?
No, could we add transport under the fee waiver?
Transport under?
Fee waiver.
Oh, we can get down, when we get to the level of activities?
Yeah, this is the previous slide.
Oh, that's just examples.
Yes,
That's just examples of the taxonomy. That's not the policy itself.
okay, sorry.
Yeah?
I just think transport should be added.
Yeah. So when we'll make sure that goes into to either the actions or the activities. Okay, so under social assistance, the goal is to prevent deprivation, contribute to poverty alleviation, and promote social inclusion. So that's the goal of social assistance. The objectives, to eliminate indigence among poor households, and I know that there was a lot of discussion about this word eliminate, but we're talking about indigence. So we're talking about the poorest of the poor, right? People who cannot even deal with their food needs, much less their non-food needs. So extreme poverty. So what we're saying is that this policy aims to eliminate extreme poverty. So you have poor households, those below the poverty line, and within that category of poor households, you have extremely poor. And so that's the group that we're looking to eliminate completely. To build the human capital of poor and vulnerable households with the aim of enabling self-reliance and reducing intergenerational poverty, and to enhance income and food security for poor and vulnerable households. So those are the three objectives. Under each of these objectives are strategic actions, if you remember the way the logic goes. So under the first objective of eliminating indigence, there's one strategic action: strengthen and expand social assistance programs and continue to increase their coverage and improve their effectiveness. So it's within this, ma'am, that 1.1.1, when we go to the level of activities, you can talk about transport subsidies. Yeah? The second strategic action, the second set of strategic actions under that objective of building human capital. The first is to strengthen and expand accompaniment programs and case management for social assistance beneficiaries to better address the multidimensionality of poverty. So it's not enough to give them a cash transfer. You also have to do the case management and build the accompaniment programs to be so that they can stand on their feet and can move outside of poverty. Sorry.
The first one, you said it was just one objective we have there?
One objective.
Okay, and it is focused on social assistance.
Yes.
Now, if we're thinking about moving persons out of indigent and more or less something, we should also have an objective in terms of empowerment, because the social assistance would only be in terms of just gathering towards filling their basket.
Okay, so this is what this second objective that we're looking at, that's what it's looking at, to build the human capital of poor and vulnerable households with the aim of enabling self-reliance and reducing intergenerational poverty. So the first objective, what we talked about was more, how do you help them from falling deeper? So in terms of the cash transfer and the in-kind assistance, etc. This one is talking about how do you build their capacity, yeah?
But I thought the intervention that you said for one was the intervention for indigent households, for persons who are indigent.
Yes, to eliminate indigence among, so it's strengthening and expanding the social assistance programs so that they have some kind of income so that they're not extremely poor. And then you go to the level then of, so how do you top them up in the first instance? And then how do you move them out is what the second objective is looking at. If that makes sense, yeah? So it's topping them up, right? Dealing with the cash and the in-kind and so forth, so that they're not extremely poor, at least they're eating, they're whatever. And then now this second objective is looking at how do you move them out, right? So like a two-step process, if you will. Make sense? All right. So under that, then the strategic action, strengthen and expand accompaniment programs, and then facilitating income generating and asset development opportunities for the poor and vulnerable, with the aim of increasing their capacity to manage risk and move out of poverty. So it's really about how do you wrap services around them, to use that social work term, and how do you strengthen these families to be able to.
But I'm not seeing the aspect of empowerment, of individual empowerment, because what we're doing there is more or less continuing the saga in terms of providing needs for them, providing what they need in terms of basic needs. But I'm thinking about empowerment, or is that at another level?
So, because the accompaniment programs are intended as empowerment, it's not only to give you this money handout or in kind, but it's the accompaniment programs are usually around how do you build your parenting capacity, how do you get health information. We're talking about income generating and asset development opportunities. So this is about the retraining of people, etc.
Okay, so that's what accompaniment program is.
These are the empowerment components here. You see it?
I probably just want to see the word empowerment. You see, building people is in terms of human development, because the accompanying programs still sounds like just assistant social handout programs or a handout program, but the empowerment aspect speaks to the individual capacity of moving the individual forward to a better level. So I think that is probably my problem.
Okay.
So
I hear you, but we're using words like self-reliance, right? Enabling self-reliance, which is, if you enable self-reliance, by definition, you have to come at it from an empowerment standpoint, yeah? And the accompaniment programs are intended to help them to better address multidimensionality of poverty. So when you're dealing with the multidimensionality of poverty, you're talking about deprivation in education, in health, in various areas. You're empowering people, because these are the things that come along with poverty, that makes them vulnerable. So when you look at case management, yeah, from a social work perspective, you're looking at the family from a holistic point of view, and that's what they normally call accompaniment programs. I can call it empowerment programs if that will make you feel more comfortable, because that's what it's intended to do. And my understanding is that your system is already dealing with some of that. It's not only about, say, the cash assistance, yeah, you figure it out. It's about, okay, so holistically, what do you need as a family? What do you need? Because the cash is only a part of it, right? So I can look at how we can use the language of empowerment in here, but that's what it's getting at, the facilitating income generating and asset development. Asset development is about empowerment, and asset development can be in many ways. You know, in rural areas, people save in terms of their livestock. They buy a chicken, they do, I don't know what you call it here, but susu and that sort of thing. So there are various ways of asset development. They build a little house, that kind of thing. So this is the empowerment piece here. But you want to see the language of empowerment. Okay? Duly noted. Let me write that here. All right. Under the third objective, to enhance income and food security for poor and vulnerable families. Sorry, there's one more strategic action under that, and it's mainstream disaster management into the social protection framework and improve existing programs' flexibility and scalability for disaster responses. So this is about how do you utilize the same social protection programs that you have, and you can expand them, do horizontal and vertical expansions when you have disasters. So there are people that you can put on because of disasters, and I think this is where you can incorporate the host families under this strategic action right here, because you can change your definition to expand out who, during times of disasters, who would be eligible for assistance, right? So you expand, that would be horizontal, that would be vertical. So you expand vertically. So apart from your regular beneficiaries, and I think you have done some of this already with the volcano, right? And COVID, you have your regular beneficiaries of social assistance, and because of COVID, you expanded the definition of who would get assistance for a time period, right? So within that vertical expansion, you could also include host families of people who are displaced, right? And sometimes you do horizontal expansions as well. So this is where you could, our technical suggestion is that under this 1.2.3 is where in the activities section, you could include host families. Make sense? All right. The other one is to enhance income and food security for poor and vulnerable households. And this strategic action we pulled straight out of your National Economic Development Plan, which says recreate an agrarian culture and increase land usage for food production. So there are a number of activities that would have to go under that. And this is straight out of that. We wanted to match it here because it was such a good match. So again, this 1.3 is about empowerment, enhancing income and food security, right? So the three objectives set up in a way that the first one is about the social assistance, the cash and in-kind assistance, right? The second one, the second objective is about self-reliance, building assets, and really moving towards empowerment. So how do you do that? You do that by active case management and putting in place programs that will help people to deal with all these issues, the lack of education, the lack of access to health, all these pieces, as well as how do they generate income. So what programs do you need to put in place for that? And then this one is further on in terms of looking specifically at food security and income security. So that's what we're trying to do with these various actions. Let me stop there. Any burning questions or concerns? I hear the issue of empowerment and wanting that specifically said, yes.
To do some of these activities, you need to have a proper data management system. And that was highlighted during the volcanic eruption. We really had issues with data management. How are you proposing to make this better under this framework?
So there's a whole section on institutional strengthening that is a cross-cutting one that will deal with exactly that. And we're talking about setting up MIS systems that can be used across sectors. So like a single information system that everybody can input. And actually it's being built already by Ministry of National Mobilization. So you will see in the institutional strengthening section that there is a whole, that is what it's dedicated to. How do you gather data? How do you share data? How do you build capacity for people to be able to implement? How do you improve coordination so that people can, so that all sectors, not only national mobilization, but education, health, agriculture, everybody involved can make these pieces work. Right? And you're so right, especially in times of disasters. This single information system is so critical, so that you know who is getting what from who are, right? Because I know this is fresh in your mind, because you could really lose track, and then the resources are finite. So the resources are limited. So some people might fall through the cracks. So we'll see that in the institutional strengthening, which is a cross-cutting, that we spend a lot of time on that. And that's why I wanted you to see the whole thing, so that you can see how all the pieces are working together. Any other questions or comments? If not, we can get into social insurance. And the goal here is to protect all Vincentians from the adverse effects of the loss of income and health-related shocks across the life cycle. So we're focusing on two pieces here in the objectives: to achieve a comprehensive social insurance system that addresses the varying needs of the Vincentian population. And here we're talking about not only social security per se, but also the non-contributory pensions. How do you get people who are not in the mainstream of labor, of the labor market, insured? What do you do about unemployment benefits, etc.? So how do we have that kind of use social insurance as a part of income security on that social protection floor? And the other aspect of it is to ensure universal access to affordable health care, which, from my understanding, is well on the way. So under the first objective, the strategic actions, to strengthen strategies to extend social security coverage to the informal sector, emerging non-traditional sectors, part-time and temporary workers, and other excluded categories of workers. So whoever, if you're the catch and kill, do you use that term here? We use that term in Belize, catch and kill, where you're a casual worker. If you are working in the gig economy, as they call it now, where it's online, you're working a little bit for this company and for that company and what have you. So how do you ensure that the social security coverage, the scheme that's available, covers everybody? So the second strategic action is to develop and implement a strategy for the progressive realization of unemployment benefits and non-contributory pensions of all eligible persons. And if you notice here, it says progressive realization, because we know this will not, this is quite an investment, no? In terms of non-contributory pensions and unemployment benefits. So to really have a think about how that could happen. Encourage and facilitate the working age population to take preventative steps to protect themselves against income loss due to old age. So this again is an empowerment piece in a way. So it's like, how do you educate people to do some of their own rainy day kind of actions, instead of saying, oh, well, boy, I've lost my job, I all know the government must take care of me. How do you help people to plan and come at it from a self-reliance point of view?
Old age and disability.
And disability, okay. Yes. I'm going to write it in, I'm writing it in my notes. And disability, 2.1.2, got it. All right. The other one the other strategic action to ensure universal access to, on the objective of ensuring universal access, simply to develop and implement a pathway to achieving universal health insurance. And that's one strategic action, but boy, that will take a lot in terms of activities. So that one thing can take the whole 15 years. Under social care.
Excuse me.
Yes, ma'am.
Question goes back to the previous. Sorry, I'm late. We want to take those that are the poorest of the poor out of that indigence. Who determines when they are at that stage to be considered out of indigence? Could I, as an individual, think to myself, since I'm being taken care of, there is no need for me to do anything to get out of here. This is my comfort zone, so I want to stay there. Are there mechanisms in place to ensure, because we have to be cognizant of the fact that the length of time that it might take for me to get out of that indigence may not be the same for my colleague. So who determines when we have gotten out of that stage? Can I turn up one day to those who are to do that, render that service, and be told that I have been on it too long, so they have decided to stop it? What precautionary or protection measures are in place to ensure that such things don't happen?
Right. So this is where the guiding principles are critical, and where your program design, because those issues are addressed in your program design. So when we talk about strengthen and expand social assistance programs and continue to increase their coverage, etc., and so forth, and improve their effectiveness, and even when we talk about the accompaniment programs, when you get into the activities, that's where you're getting into program design. Because to answer your question, in your program design, you should have a targeting mechanism, yeah? So it's not an arbitrary or subjective decision about, well, you, and you. It should be as scientific as possible. And I know that the ministry is moving towards a more objective targeting mechanism as well. There are many ways to do this. You could do it through a proxy means test, which sets up a mathematical algorithm, and you plug in these things and it spits out certain levels, etc. So there are ways, tried and true, that you could do this. So decisions are being made about what your targeting mechanism should look like. It should also have, within the context of that program design, should also have issues around graduation. So what is the criteria for you to no longer be eligible? Yeah? And that's why the accompaniment programs that I talked about, or the empowerment programs, are so important. Because if you're going to have a graduation, then you just can't tell people, well, you know, especially if you have a time frame. Because some of these programs in other places have a time frame to say, well, 2 years and then you're done. You have to have accompaniment programs that will help you to graduate, yeah? And will wrap services around you as a part of the empowerment process to move you out and towards self-reliance, yeah? So that's in your program design. There should also be a grievance mechanism within your program design, so that if I believe that, you know what, I'm supposed to be on this program, you know, but I think that I'm being discriminated against, or I think that maybe your screening tool kind of missed me, because the screening tool, even although it's a mathematical algorithm or whatever it is, it's not perfect, yeah? So some people may fall through the cracks. So there should be a grievance mechanism where you can say, you know what, I think you got it wrong. I think that I should be on this program, and there's a process to check through to say, oh yes, for true, we didn't factor this in, or whatever is the case, right? Or a grievance mechanism to say, you detect me off too quick, right? And also in terms of the public education. So this is where too, in the program design, some of these same principles that we talked about, guiding principles within this general policy, should play in terms of non-discrimination, in terms of equity, in terms of having information, so the participatory approaches, etc., so that you can have information about what your rights are, what your entitlements are, right? So that's how it works. That if you are doing this from a human rights perspective to begin with, from a perspective of equity and equality and non-discrimination and dignity, then these things have to be objective, they have to be clear, and people need to know what they are on the front end. And if you tell people, well, I want you to move from point X to point Y, that there is help to move people. These accompaniment programs, these empowerment programs, so that people can move along. Yeah? Yes.
The last point you made about dignity and all of that, I just wanted us to add the section on political interference, because I know that a lot of times it may be a perception, but that is how it is out there. So I think we should add political interference as well to that.
I have that in political affiliation, and also under the issue of transparency and accountability, that takes it into consideration also to say, the transparency principle is saying, I need to know what my rights are, what my entitlements are, what the program entails, and I need to know how I get on and get off. And I need to know that nobody interferes with that. So yes, I will make sure that I highlight that part.
Excuse me.
Yes, ma'am.
I have a question in relation to the health insurance.
Yes.
And I know that most of our, a lot of our budget goes into assistance for healthcare. And I'm thinking that the health insurance aspect is not going to be ready until in terms of the long term, what you said in terms of the long term goal of the 15 years or so after, or probably 50. I am wondering I don't know what the activities will be in terms of what we are thinking will be in the short term, but I'm wondering if we will have something like a health supplementary literacy program, in the sense that, because most of us, even working people, don't have health insurance because of the cost that is associated with it. And so there has to be some sort of literacy program where persons can start putting aside even a $5 or something to help them if something happened in the long run. That is a support mechanism. So I really don't know, but the health insurance aspect is going to be very important, and very important in the sense that even mobilization at times will be able to help persons to provide that buying medicine for persons, their persons who are in need. So I'm wondering what we will do in terms of the social protection in the health aspect. I don't know if it's a different realm, that in terms of let health take that on, but when you think about social protection itself, you understand why health is a very important aspect of that. Right. So I don't want us to focus so much on the insurance because it's a 50-year plan, but in terms of what we can do now to help persons in that aspect.
And that's why it's talking about a pathway, because you're right, because the whole issue of healthcare is not only the absence of, health is not only the absence of disease, no? So it has to do with the prevention pieces as well, you know, that could be a part of the activity. What is envisioned here is something along the lines of what the UK, maybe the UK is the best example, but maybe one that we're familiar with, what the UK has in terms of its national insurance scheme, yeah? Where people can access a GP at relatively low cost, and things like that, and you could even get tertiary level care. And in certain systems, it's prorated. So depending on your level, if you can pay, then you should pay, no? Especially at higher levels, yeah? And that sort of thing. So there's different ways of configuring this so that people can have a guaranteed access to health care and health insurance, to use that term. But you're right, a part of it is also about how do we deal with the non-communicable diseases, yeah? How do we do the diabetes prevention? How do we do the hypertension prevention in diets, etc., so that you don't reach to the point of needing all the metformin and all the insulin and your leg cut off and the disability, etc., that then becomes more expensive in terms of insurance and care under insurance, no? So, and then how do people, yeah, chip in, and at what levels? So that's why this is, you're right, this is a long-term kind of thing, and looking at other systems that have done it. And I like to say one of the good things about small countries like ours is you could run it like one pilot project if you really want. Few people, right? So you could really look at it. But within the activities, I think what you're talking about can be reflected. Make sense? But I'll note that to see how we can strengthen as well. So strengthening the other aspects. All right. Within social care, the goal, provide appropriate support to socially vulnerable persons and households to address the complex challenges in their lives that create barriers to the full enjoyment of their rights. Sorry, we took out that language of socially, and so it's just provide appropriate support to vulnerable persons and households. The objectives, to prevent vulnerable populations, to protect vulnerable populations from all forms of abuse, neglect, violence, discrimination, and social exclusion, to ensure the availability and access to basic social services, including health, education, affordable housing, water, and sanitation by the most vulnerable groups, are the two big objectives. Under strategic actions, for that first objectives of protection from all forms of abuse, strengthen and expand psychosocial support services across all stages of the life cycle, with special attention to vulnerable groups, including expectant adolescent mothers, adolescent parents, youth at risk, persons with disabilities, single parents living below the vulnerability line, older persons, children in state care, gender-based violence victims and survivors, and persons with mental health issues. So it's basically looking at how do you ensure that you have psychosocial support for all the vulnerable groups according to their needs. And the other one, adopt and implement a human rights-based response to adequately meet the identified needs of persons with disabilities in tandem with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The other strategic actions, support the institutionalization of evidence-based approaches for the screening, detection, assessment, and interventions with persons with mental health issues. Develop policies and improve accompanying services that enable children, older persons, and persons with disabilities to remain in kinship care settings. So how do you build in support to families that want to care for these categories rather than pulling them out into institutional care? How do you deal with the issues of abandonment, sir, is what we're getting at here. Now, so how does the state support this idea of kinship care? Because we know that institutions, even the best run institutions, even the kindest, with the kindest of caregivers, are really no substitute for good kinship care, for those people who love and care for you. And sometimes people, your family, as we know, they want to, but there are some economic realities that they have to deal with, right? So how does the state ensure that families are supported to take care of their own, is what, especially when it comes to these vulnerable groups. The other strategic actions support linkages to productive social safety nets for survivors of gender-based violence to address issues of economic dependence. So we know that one of the big drivers of gender-based violence is economic dependence. So how do you link these survivors back into the social assistance programs, the programs that will help them with the cash assistance, as well as help them with case management to be able to stand on their own 2 feet. So making that link right back, which I think the ministry is already doing, but how do we ensure that those linkages are stronger? The other strategic actions: develop and implement a continuum of care for victims and survivors of gender-based violence and child abuse. So everything from prevention to intervention, particularly children who are in state care. How do we put in place a robust foster care system to move them along before they're 18, adoptions, that sort of thing, cater for them, prepare them for independent living when they age out, that sort of thing we're talking about. So a continuum of care. And develop and implement psychosocial services for perpetrators of gender-based violence. This came through very, very clearly in the sector consultations, that we have to deal with these perpetrators as well. And we have to develop programs and services for them as well. No? If not, they go from, it's not enough to help the victim become a survivor, but it's how do you deal with the perpetrator and their actions, because they go from one toxic relationship to another, as we know. All right, under the second objective of ensuring availability and access to basic social services, strengthen and expand access to essential healthcare services, including maternity and geriatric, sorry, my tongue is not working, care, particularly in the Grenadine Islands. This came through very clearly that people in the Grenadine Islands believe that there was a discrepancy in services, especially maternity services. They're talking about, particularly when we talk to the group in Union Island, that, you know, for a high-risk pregnancy, it becomes more high risk because you have to come into town, come into Kingston, into St. Vincent to be able to access proper services. So strengthening that essential healthcare services out there. Ensure access to adequate, safe, and affordable housing and basic services for vulnerable groups. Increase access to sexual and reproductive health information, and where legally permitted, services and commodities for youth to deal with this whole aspect of teenage pregnancy, especially. And I'll stop there for social care to see if there are any comments. I know it's a lot. It's a lot. But I wanted us to see the whole thing. Yes, ma'am.
Just to say, we were talking about the issue of how to determine the criteria for certain services. And you also mentioned in terms of the redress if someone thinks that they would have been, missed in terms of how they are categorized for assistance. So, what would be important even in all of this as we are setting up the system is that to have proper, even as we set up the assessment systems, to have that verification in terms of, do the various checks with the different the home visits and all these things in terms of proper case management. Because while it's good to have that clinical assessment tool that would help us with the algorithms and these things, also, it does not take away from having certain information verified on the ground, and that is how it would even help to fill in some of the gaps, of persons who may inadvertently get, dropped off the list by error.
Yeah, and that's a part of what your grievance mechanism does also, because, apart from, it's hard sometimes to go and check everybody's house, but at least you have a mechanism where people can come in and say, hey, you have me wrong, and so then you can send somebody on the ground to see if what's happening, So that's a part of an important redress mechanism indeed.
Just to add to what Mrs. Boyd said, we have to try to encourage that culture of producing documentation. One of the bigger issues that we have, people do not like to provide documentation. Simply birth certificates for children to make sure that they are the parents, it is difficult. When you come to salary slips, they don't even want to give you the categories that they earn where possible. So we have to try to encourage that in order for us to get the true information and to address the cases properly. We have to encourage that culture of providing documentation. Thank you.
A challenge, I know, a challenge. Do you have a problem here with birth registration? Do you have a high percentage of, like most children are registered?
Yes, I think
okay. All right. Because in Belize, we had a problem with that. So what we did was when people came in, a part of the accompaniment services was to register the children.
No, I don't think we have that problem
So,
here.
yeah,
Children are generally
excellent.
registered.
Excellent. Any other questions or comments? All right, so sir, I hope you've seen that the older persons are sufficiently reflected in here, and you don't see them yet? All right, you have to see more. Okay.
All right,
Yes.
Judith, just to respond to one of the points that you made with reproductive health issues. I know that we've worked on the adolescent health policy and that there is access to services. I think where it's lacking is where the information is available and the communication for persons to know where and what type of access they have to the services. That is one of the challenges that we have. So we need to do a lot of more of advocacy in ensuring that persons are aware, and equity in terms of challenges in the Grenadines as opposed to what's available on mainland. So some of the services that are available on mainland are not all available in the Grenadines. So we have to look at the equity issues where those are concerned. So those are more of the challenges that we have as opposed to access.
Okay. What we had here was increased access to SNRH information.
Right. So the information is available because they also have gone to social platforms. The Ministry of Health has done that through the National Family Planning Program.
Okay.
So that is being dealt with.
Okay. All right. So the labor market, this is a fourth block. Labor market policies and interventions. And the goal is simply to increase access to labor market and decent work. And decent work has a definite definition under ILO, and that's in the glossary, no? So it's very measurable from that perspective. The objectives there to facilitate employment opportunities and income generating activities for the unemployed, underemployed, and other vulnerable groups, such as women, youth, and persons with disability. To support the development of livelihood potential among poor and vulnerable populations, and to increase access by poor and vulnerable populations to productive resources. So it's not only about developing their capacity, as in the second, the 4.2, and supporting them in that respect, but also resources, because oftentimes we know, and we heard this over and over again, people get skills training, but it doesn't translate into jobs, you know, and a lot of the barriers are around them accessing productive resources, capital or advice or whatever it is that people need. So under the first strategic action, the strategic actions under the first objectives, strengthen and expand policies accompanying legislation and comprehensive actions that promote economic development and decent work for the poor and vulnerable to increase their capacity to manage risk and rise out of poverty. The second action, ensure the protection of labor rights and the promotion of safe working environments for all workers, with emphasis on those in precarious and informal employment. Then ensure an enabling environment that encourages direct investments which provide decent work, livelihood opportunities, and local economic development. And this one was the private sector, really. This came from the private sector saying, you know, we need incentives to be able to invest or to have partnerships with foreign direct investors, etc., so that we're able to create jobs, really. So this is in response to them. And develop and implement a labor market exchange strategy. The second objective in supporting the development of livelihood potentials, the first action, strengthen and expand access for all vulnerable groups to microfinance grants and credit facilities. And I know there's quite a bit going on, but there's a call for it to be kind of streamlined and expanded out for more coverage. You know? So prime and different programs like that, people are calling for even more.
Hello.
Yes.
Go back to the force one. Coming from the labor movement,
Yes, sir.
and understanding the situation, there is a serious situation that will affect vulnerable people. A fair wage for their service. So even though we might say decent work and all that, at the end of the day, presently right now, our workers are being exploited and not getting a fair wage for their labor.
So right on if you can go back, Otto, please. The 4.1.1, strengthen and expand policies accompanying legislation and comprehensive actions that promote economic development and decent work for the poor. So one of the first activities then, from what I'm hearing from you, under that 4.1.1 would be to amend the Labor Act to deal with issues of minimum wage. Yeah?
But even that is, has been in place.
Or to increase the minimum
How
wage.
increase it?
Yeah. So that's one of the first activities that would come under that 4.1.1 from your perspective.
Yes.
Okay. I hear you. All right. If you can go, yes. Thank you, Otto. So back to these strategic actions under the second objectives of the development of livelihood potentials. The access to the credit facilities. The second one is increasing the number of adults and youth who transition from technical and vocational skills training to decent work and entrepreneurship opportunities. And this is a direct response to what we heard over and over again. With the train, but it's not translating. It's not translating. We still have high rates of unemployment among young people. So, really to look at how do the strategic action of what activities you have to undertake to increase that number who transition. Creating strong linkages between social assistance programs and broader labor-related policy measures that assist beneficiaries to access employment and productive livelihoods. Where is my friend from here? This directly also relates to the empowerment issue, right? This is apart from the social assistance, we said it here too. How do you move people off the rolls? How do you, and that direct link between social assistance and labor activation as they use that terminology. Under the third objective, to increase access to productive resources, strengthen and expand access for all vulnerable, that goes there as well. Actually, this is a cross-referenced one. I'm sorry. This expansion into finance grants, microfinance grants and credit facilities. So this we link them under those two objectives because they link to those two objectives. The other one is mainstream ICT and promote digital platforms as a means of facilitating inclusion in the labor market, with emphasis on youth and persons with disabilities. So we know that ICT can be a powerful tool in terms of including persons with disabilities. And young people are just so savvy in terms of, so how do you set up these platforms? How do you make sure that internet is available at the speed that's needed and that it's affordable so that young people can work for companies, call centers, or do their own things. I mean, this also helps persons with disabilities too. They can work, even blind people, with the right technology and ICT. How do you incentivize that? Because it can be a powerful tool for inclusion. The other strategic action, increase youth involvement in agriculture, especially through agricultural training and access to land. So this links back again to the food security issue, to the strategic action under the economic development plan as well. So how do we get young people more involved in agriculture? Mainstream exposure and, where appropriate, access to vocational and technical training at all levels of the educational system. So, how do we ensure that young people are seeing VOTEC as a first option and not as something that you do when you can't make it in academics? How do we acknowledge that young people have different types of intelligences, right? There are some people who can sit and think out all sorts of things academically, and others who are just good with their hands and they have other talents. And if you are developing a country, you have to have technical people. You have to have the plumbers. You have to have the construction workers. You have to have those types of people. So how do you foster that from the beginning in young people so that they don't see it as a last resort? And let me stop there. Any feedback? Yes, ma'am.
Hello. I thought was fluid.
Tell me.
And culture and craft. In this country, a lot of our cultural aspect is weaving and craft works and those sort of things. We were once known for have a high quality of local craft. And it seems to be dying out with the older folks who has that skill. Mm-hmm. And because you'd look at it as something not off because of cultural penetration from outside. of other things. So we are losing that aspect whereby persons used to make a livelihood out of these things. And I don't know how, but that is why you have a lot of people on the block. No longer, they have the talent, but they don't believe in themselves that these things is worth anything anymore.
So I guess we could put that under activity here with the mainstream exposure to VOTEC, because would that be, who are the education experts in here? Would like the craft skills, and so that would be considered VOTEC, no?
Because it goes right back into the mass men and those sort of things.
Yes.
Even certain cultural dance and them sort of things. People don't see it as a way of a livelihood anymore.
Okay, so looking at livelihood options, that's a good one. Yes, thank you. Any other comments on this? I promise lunch after this. That's the good news. I hope so, Miriam. I hope I'm not promising something I can't deliver.
Yes, based on what you just presented, in terms of action, because I noticed there a need to have a database system set up, right? Where you purposefully targeting the vulnerable populations, right? And I'm thinking, I don't think currently we have like an employment agency in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So I'm thinking perhaps within the Ministry of Mobilization, National Mobilization, you can have such a database set up, especially when you would have done, you have persons who would have done targeted sessions, whether in skills, training, tech work, you name it. Whether they are farmers, young people too. So you know what they have, you know their potential. So you have a database set up, and you know when there are vacancies now, they can come in and you can help them. You have a special service set up where you can actually help them to find jobs. It could be a day job, for example. There's a conference today, they can come in and serve, and so on and so forth. But I think to really target them and to make sure you're reaching them, have this database set up where you have, what their skill orientations are, and you can help them to find employment, whether temporary or permanent.
So when we spoke to, if you notice under 4.1.4, it says develop and implement a labor market exchange strategy, including a program. And this, my understanding from the Ministry of Labor is that's exactly what they're doing. They're trying to set up this database, as you described, for that exchange. But it's more, as they talked about it, and that's why we said strategy, it's more than just a database, right? It's about the flows that you're talking about and how everything is going to work. Because you can have these people sitting in this database, but how do you match them? Are there accompanying services? That sort of thing. So how do you build around an entire strategy to make sure that this labor market exchange, that there is this link between the people who have skills and those who are seeking employees, right? So the Ministry of Labor is already working on this, and we have it reflected in that strategic action of 4.1.4. Because you're spot on. And those are the links. That's a part of the link too, no? From the social assistance programs into labor market activation, or labor market activation. How do you move people along to empowerment and self-reliance? So yes, I'm glad for that question, because that means we're on the right page. All right, any other questions or comments, inclusions? All right, can I check in, Miriam, to see if we have lunch, and this is a good time to stop? It's on its way, okay. So let me present one more part, which is institutional strengthening, and then after lunch, we'll get into some group work, right? So you'll be pleased to know that I will stop talk and then we'll get and then we'll get into. But I talked a lot. I don't like talking a lot, but I really thought that it was necessary for us to go through this entire policy, and just the reactions that I'm getting has enriched the whole thing. So institutional strengthening, the goal, this is a cross-cutting one, yeah, that we talked about, is to facilitate synergies and integration among social protection policy actors via effective implementation of a robust collaborative model. And the objective there, to strengthen the government's technical, logistical coordination capacity to effectively and efficiently design, deliver, and evaluate social protection in SVG. So this is talking about your whole program design, your ability to design your programs, to deliver on the ground. What platforms are you using? Are you using cash cards? So to build capacity there. To diversify the funding base for sustainable universal social protection. So in this, we were looking at things like not only cash money and grants that could come from various international development partners, but also technical assistance and support, so the in-kind. How do you make use of all the bilateral cooperation, all the regional cooperation, etc., bring all of that to bear to be able to craft this universal social protection floor. To establish a coordination mechanism for social protection at the policy, administrative, and delivery levels. And I really want us to talk a little bit more about that, what that mechanism should look like. To establish an effective monitoring and evaluation system for social protection. So those are the main areas. What I want you to do this afternoon is to look at the institutional strengthening aspects, because we had looked at the sector areas in the sectorial consultations, but we didn't. Many groups did not have time to look at the institutional strengthening. And since that's a cross-cutting issue, I wanted us to take some time to really look at it. And to see if it really, really addresses all the concerns that you have about how we're going to make the other 4 pieces of this policy work. Because that's really what the institutional strengthening piece is about. How do we make the policy work? How do we move it from just a static document to action on the ground for people, gains on the ground for people? Right? So that's one of the things that I would want to ask if you could look at this afternoon. And then you can delve into the strategic actions. I'm not going to go into that, into any details, because I'm going to ask you to look at the details of it. So Otto, can you go forward since we're waiting for lunch? Go forward right there, right. Okay, so what you will see then, so that's the policy, yeah? And you see the logic that we've talked about in terms of the goals, the objectives, and then pulling through in the next slide, you will see the strategic actions by objectives. And this is the example for social assistance. And then below that, we have gone another level from the strategic actions to activities. So how do you really implement those strategic actions? And some good work has been done around that, and I will ask you all to do a little bit more. I see the lunch is here, and I know we Caribbean people, we don't play with our rice hours, right? So I just want to pause and ask if there are any questions or comments or things that you really didn't see reflected in those 4 areas that would bring about a comprehensive social protection framework. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. One of the things that I was agreeing with the people from education with is the targeted training. You said earlier that we have been seeing the training and we have not seen it materializing. So what I think may be lacking is the coordination between ministries. For example, well, not only ministries, but between services and institutions connected. For example, where we deal with teaching service, you might find that there are many teachers who might have been trained in a particular area, but there are no vacancies in a particular area. Whereas in terms of like things like music and, there are areas where teachers are needed, but because there were no one trained there is a scarcity of that. And I think even in agriculture, even though we might say that the young people may not want to go into agriculture, I think if we coordinate it properly between educational training in agriculture and the Ministry of Education, and we link it with the farmers and so on, where you have that smooth linkage across the board, we may be seeing more people taking it up. So I think there is need for linkages, consultation among the ministries.
Okay. I'm noting that here. All right. Any other comments? Or we're just about ready for lunch? I think so. I saw something go back there. So I'm hoping that we are ready. Miriam, we're ready. Samantha? Because this would be a good place to break.